وصحبه أجمعين. I first wanted to preface it by saying, before I said anything about this, to kind of underpin it, that we mustn't lose sight of the significance of this gathering that we're having here, in this 18th century farmhouse. It's been here 300 years, and now there's a group of Muslims here, from diverse, different backgrounds, all worshipping Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, the Lord, the Creator and the Lord of the universe, in the way that is pleasing to Him, that He has called us to through the final messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the fact that this is happening here is an extraordinary miracle from Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. We mustn't lose sight of that in taking our presence here for granted. We can't take it for granted. It's an extraordinary thing that Allah Ta'ala has put us here. And this is what I want to say. He's not only put us here, we're representative of a lot of other people. There are 3 million Muslims here, brought by Allah Ta'ala, put in this place. And you cannot overestimate the effect that hundreds of thousands of people worshipping Allah Ta'ala in the way that He has ordained every Jummah, you cannot underestimate the effect that will have on the place we live in. So this is what is behind, what underlies this, the fact that we're here and Islam is here, and Allah Ta'ala has put us here, and we have, and our presence here, in this gathering, is to try and discuss how we can make our presence here more effective, how we can spread the deen, how we can make the deen of Allah Ta'ala more relevant to the people of this land. So this is what's underlying this thing, this behind it, the worship of Allah Ta'ala being brought here and representing. We're representatives of those who are establishing it and doing everything we can to establish it. And all of this is Allah's plan, and it's all in the hands of Allah Ta'ala, and His plan is what is going to happen. We want something, Allah wants something, but what Allah wants will certainly happen, will certainly take place. So this is, but we're talking here about how the best way we can go about this. So the reason for me coming up with this is something that has frustrated, I think, a great many of us. It is the fact that this crazed violence of these few people who commit it in the streets of London and elsewhere, in Manchester, in Paris, and all where it's going on. These crazed people are being. This is genuinely being attributed to something to do with our deen, which of course it hasn't actually got anything to do with the way that Islam should be put into practice and established among us. But definitely the perception has come about that this does in fact have something to do with Islam. So it was what I wanted to do with this piece was to try and point out what the real roots of this crazed violence are, and also to show a way in which the true faith of Islam can gradually emerge in the country in which we all live. And it's divided into 8 parts. There's a short introduction. There are then 6 different kind of sections in it, and then there's a conclusion at the end. So I've got to go just to say what these are. The first paragraph is really the introduction, why the thing is being written. It's about this violence that's going on, and how it can be, what it is, and how it can be counteracted. Then I try and look a little bit about the origins, about the real causation of this behavior. And to do that, I look at, I refer a lot to a book called The Age of Anger by a man called Pankaj Mishra, which is well worth reading if you can get hold of it. And he points out, as many others too have, that that in fact this kind of nihilistic violence is in fact related to what happened in the Enlightenment, and so the first point is pointing out how, in fact, it relates much more to the French Revolution and what happened from that than anything to do with any Islamic source at all. And I talk about the emotion of resentment, which is what really lies behind this outbreak of violence, it's not only it's been going on for the last 200 years, and it's always got some kind of ideological justification, but in fact it's to do with alienation and feeling at odds with the society in which you live. Started with the main manifestation of it was really in Russia and with the Bakunin and his followers of the anarchists of that time. So that's really the first part of the book, is looking at the origins of this violence and where it comes from. And then the reason I'm doing that is because the British government and the policy of the government, particularly as it was expressed by David Cameron in a book in a speech that he gave in 2015, in which he says that the cause of this is the ideology of Islamic extremism. So he talked about this being the real cause of this of what was happening, and the purpose of this first is to show that was never the cause of it, and there are and it's admitted by their own people, in fact, that the cause is much more to do with alienation and identity problems, and those things are much more the cause of this violence than anything to do with any Islamic doctrine. So that's this kind of the first section, and then I talk a little bit about how if you do that, you will in fact make the situation worse and make it more likely for young Muslims who feel alienated to be seduced by the propaganda and by the propagandists who are looking for people to carry out this violence. And then I say that because of this, because this is what the government are trying to do, and because it's in fact exacerbating the situation and making it worse, what is needed is, rather than and all that's based in what's it based on? What is the policy that the government are putting into practice? What's it called? Prevent, yeah, prevent. So the prevent policy is all about making the Muslims feel more alienated than they already are. And in fact, what's needed is a reverse of policy, which is to make the Muslims feel welcome rather than the opposite. And to justify that, there's a man called James Ferguson who's written a book which is also very well worth reading. I don't know whether you've seen it, called, has anyone seen it? Al-Britannia. Al-Britannia, My Country it's called. And he wrote a book. He came to Bradford, he went all the way around the country. He stayed with me for a couple of days as well, as part of it. And he went all the way around the Muslim community and discovered how counterproductive the prevent strategy was being, and how much better it would be to affirm the Muslim presence rather than to make the Muslims feel alienated. So that's the second section. And then the third section, I talk about education and how the people who are seduced by this evil propaganda are in fact people who know very little about Islam. Nearly always, they're all people who, you know, the famous Islam for dummies, the thing and there's not one of these people who are convicted of terrorism has had any real education in Islam. So what's needed is not less education; it's more education. And on that basis, I say that what is needed is, for the Muslims and for everyone else actually in their own religion, is religious instruction, not this smorgasbord approach of teaching everybody about every religion, just a little bit about it. Don't know about what you think about that. How did you approach that in King's Academy?
We basically we taught 3 subjects in depth in religious education: Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. However, we used to have the themes of our assemblies were not focused necessarily on Islam per se, but more character development, sort of more universal values.
Well, I think that's certainly a very important place for that. But there's also a place within the school system for religious instruction, for everyone to be instructed in their own religion in a deep way. Because when I was at school, at that time, there was no idea of learning about Buddhism or Hinduism or anything else. We were just taught Christian doctrine. And I think that kind of religious instruction should go on. And if that went on, then it would make people far more at home with make the Muslims much more at home with their identity as Muslims, and therefore be able to relate much more from a strong identity with the society around them. That's what I'm saying here about religious instruction, rather than kind of this religious education which at the moment is given. And I say, well, it's not that people shouldn't learn about other religions, but they should first of all be instructed in their own faith properly. So it won't be popular probably to hear that, but that's what's needed. Then I talk a little bit about how it has to come from both sides, and the Muslims themselves don't help the situation in some ways. I talk about the several things. Sometimes there are groups, I say here, for example, it's the stated aim of certain groups within the Muslim community in Britain to do all they can to preserve in every possible way their distinct and separate cultural identity. So people do this. I know, for instance, there's a group of Somalis in London who insist on making their children completely live within a Somali environment with the object that they're going to go back to Somalia, and they mustn't get involved in British life in any way. We all know there are various groups in the community who have this approach to the deen, and I'm saying that because that is never Islam is never going to be properly established here if that continues to be the case with too many people. talk about because you can't transplant a culture from one place to another, because it's largely to do with geographical considerations in the place where that culture grew up. You can't transplant it into another place. If you do, it's not going to work. And so I talk about the mosques as well. Some mosques become kind of cultural, ethnic, cultural, linguistic enclaves where even, I mean, I've been in mosques where I don't feel at all welcome. I'm sure all of us had that expression. Some other mosque that is run by a particular group, you don't feel at home there. Even they should be places where all mosques should be places where all Muslims feel at home. And that isn't the case. And that also applies to the architecture of mosques. There's one mosque you may have seen in Bradford, which is pink. It's pink because all the bricks, all the stones that make it up are brought from India, and it's got these. It looks as though it's come down on a magic carpet and landed there. And it has got nothing at all to do with anything anywhere under. And yet there are other mosques in Bradford. The Westgate Mosque is one example, which fit into the. So all of this is to do with the Deen belonging in the place, and then the dressing as well. The way of dressing is another. And the point that I'm making there is that everywhere where Islam has been established in the world, wherever it is, it's as if it's always been there. There's no sense of it having come from somewhere else. In China, the Muslims are Chinese. In the subcontinent, they're quite clearly from there. In Africa, they're from there. Wherever you look in the world, in Indonesia, all the agriculture, the architecture, the dress, everything belongs to that place. So it's quite clear to not. So that should be the case and that inshallah gradually will grow up here. There will become a similar kind of cultural climatization. So that's that section about about what we can do to play our part in integrating. Of course, all the time one has to realize it's a tightrope, because what the energy is being directed us is to assimilate. In other words, to lose our identity as Muslims, to become and that's happened in some places. There were a strong group of Muslims, for instance, in the middle of Australia. They brought camels. They've completely disappeared. And the same happened in South America. So one has to be careful to not let that happen, to retain an integral identity as Muslims, but at the same time fit into the place where we are. So a cultural manifestation of Islam in this place is able to grow up. So that is I talk about that there, and then. There is another aspect which I don't remember whether anybody remembers the speech of that the ex-Archbishop of Canterbury gave